first keynote of the day. Remember, we've got 3. This is number 1. And this one is going to be delivered by the amazing Michael Solomon, who is not only a professor of marketing at the Hobbs School of Business at St. Joseph's University, Philadelphia, but he is also an industry consultant. The title of his talk is 4 Basic Unshakable Fundamental Marketing Truths and Why You Should Ignore Them. So the floor is yours, Michael. Thank you so much for being with us.
I want to talk today about some basic assumptions that we make about our customers. And of course, this conference is about strategic vision. And really, when it comes to marketing and especially to understanding our customers, one of the basic strategic issues that we grapple with is figuring out who are our customers and how do we reach them, how do we talk to them. So that's something that I want to address, and I've been studying consumer behavior for way too many years. Seen a lot of things happen, but even before COVID hit, in the last 5-10 years, obviously we've been witnessing some really earth-shaking disruptions in the market. Everybody at this conference knows that there's nothing new about that. What's interesting, by the way, about the pandemic, people ask me all the time, how has the pandemic changed consumer behavior? And my answer is typically, other than maybe transitioning to elbow bumps instead of handshakes, it really hasn't changed. What it has done is it has accelerated changes that were already in place that were happening before the pandemic. Like you may remember the retail apocalypse and talk about bricks and mortar stores closing, and all that was before any of us had ever heard of COVID. One of the biggest issues that we grapple with today in marketing is very simply getting our customers' attention. And a huge problem that we all have is sensory overload. We're all maybe on the verge of burning out, chasing our tails up all day long and being exposed to literally thousands of marketing messages every single day. By some estimates, about 4,000 to 5,000 marketing messages the average person is exposed to. By no means do we pay attention to all of those. Obviously, our poor little brains couldn't handle that. But there's definitely way too much stimulation out there. And that's a problem that's growing steadily as the information that we can access is virtually unlimited today. Of course, it's another conversation whether that information is accurate or valid. But whatever it is we think we're learning, there's a lot more of it that's trying to get into our poor little heads. And so that really creates a huge strategic challenge for marketers, because today, of course, in addition to the big companies that traditionally controlled the microphone, if you will, obviously everyday people, anybody who has an axe to grind is able to get out there. And sometimes, of course, it's very hard to distinguish who are the sources that we want to hear from and who are the sources we wish would go hide under a rock somewhere. But because of that, or at least that's one driver, what we see is that we are all struggling with how to engage our customers. And this, when I talk to companies and when I give keynotes at conferences, this is always really at the top of the list. I've got consumers who are bored, or I've got consumers who really believe in brand parity. In other words, they think, well, all the brands are pretty much the same. They all do pretty much the same thing, which is the last thing that a brand marketer wants to hear. So that becomes an issue that we have to talk about, I think. How do we boost that kind of engagement? Well, obviously, the easy answer is we make the message relevant to the receiver. We try to show the receiver how the value proposition that we have is something that's going to directly or perhaps indirectly help them in some way achieve a goal, move them forward on some project in terms of how they define themselves and all of that stuff. And as we think about this process of engagement that's so crucial today, I think it's helpful to go and actually revisit a couple of models or perspectives on this process that help to just anchor us and remind us that this is a process. You don't get your customers' loyalty overnight. It's very much a process. Many of you are probably familiar with the AIDA model, which has been around for many years, and it's not rocket science. But it reminds us that we have to move people down a funnel. We hear a lot of talk today about sales funnels, and we have to start at the top by getting people's attention before we can move them down this funnel. And again, this is a bit of a roadblock here because everybody wants to get the consumer's attention in what has been called an eyeball economy. I've done a lot of thinking and work on involvement over the years. How do we get consumers to believe that a product or service or store perhaps is really something that's worth their attention? Again, prioritizing in a time when there are many, many things out there that are clamoring for our attention. And so this is what I like to call the magic pyramid of involvement, which reminds us that when you have a strategic vision, when you want to you move your customers from a very basic state of just figuring out who you are all the way to really, really craving your product, you have to move through a series of steps. And I think it's worth reminding ourselves about this. So we start at a very basic level at the bottom of the pyramid. And by the way, the reason this is a pyramid, and we love pyramids in marketing, we have a bunch of them. And one reason is that, of course, as we get to the apex at the top, the amount of people that we're talking about that we still have in terms of our desire to engage them is going to shrink because we're going to lose people along the way. But that's okay, because the people that we wind up with at the end, hopefully, if we're doing our jobs, are going to be your true believers, and they're going to be punching well above their weight in terms of the value that they bring to your organization. So we might start when we want it at that initial stage of awareness in the AIDA model. You might start with just sensations. That is, how does this product, if it's a physical product, how does it make me feel? How does it appeal to my emotions? And we're seeing a lot more attention today to what's often called sensory marketing, which reflects a recognition that our eyes are, of course, incredibly important. The visual channel is very important in terms of how we learn about brands. But we also have the other four senses out there. And to the extent that you can engage the senses, you're going to be really at an advantage. So at that very basic level, we might see a message like this, which, I love. I always love ads that have no captions or words in them, because it's such a creative challenge, and they do such a great job sometimes of engaging you and telling a story. And I'll come back to that theme of telling a story shortly. Excuse me. Once we are at that level, and we have people's awareness, then we can start to move them up and start to tell them some things about our brand. They're not going to be receptive to that until we have engaged them, at least initially. And so here's where we're going to start to see lots of informational executions when people may want to know the different facts, the pros and cons of, for example, sustainable agriculture, if you will. And then we start to move up to where we get into the interesting stuff and where most decisions are made, which is not really at the cognitive level. It's actually at the emotional level. And we know that these emotions, whether happy or sad or angry or whatever it is, are very primal. This is the most primal way that we experience products. And Obviously, to the extent that we can engage people's emotions, we're in much better shape. So this is this is actually a drawing from a real marketing research study that was done some years ago, and it had to do with frozen desserts, and in this case the Dove bar, if you're familiar with that, not working for Dove bar. And you can see here this person has drawn a picture of himself, and he said, and this is real emotion here. I'll kill everyone in the store in front of me if they don't have it, and I need a Dove bar now. You know, that's a great form of emotional engagement. But it's not the final form of engagement. The final form is what I call resonance. And if we achieve resonance, what we've done is essentially, in a psychological sense at least, to really merge the product with the person, so that as the consumer looks at that brand and says, you know, this is something that is really integral to who I am. It really helps to define myself as a person. Perhaps it helps to define how I want other people to see me. And so I think this photo says it all, you know, part man, part BMW. And, you know, we have expressions like you are what you drive, you are what you eat, you are what you wear. And there's actually a lot of truth to that, because we find in research that consumers are profoundly affected by the brands that they choose to consume. And these play a huge role in helping each of us to chart our path as we're starting to make our way, maybe post-pandemic, and define who we are in these turbulent times. So when I talk about resonance, I define this as the goodness of fit between the meanings that a brand is claiming to have. And by the way, if your brand doesn't claim to have any meanings at all, if it's just about functionality, you're probably going to be left at the starting gate. You need to show consumers why the product is really going to benefit them. But to the extent that those meanings align with the meanings that the consumer is seeking, let's say it's wellness, let's say it's sustainable agriculture. I'll keep coming back to that great example. As you can imagine, the brands that promise that and of course follow through on that promise are going to resonate with consumers and be incredibly difficult to dislodge from them. In other words, once you've embraced a brand like this, it's actually sometimes called a fortress brand, because if it's successful at getting itself kind of involved in some way in the consumer's daily life in an important way, it's very difficult for a challenger brand then to come in and replace it. And we all have brands like that. Maybe they're popular brands, maybe they're niche brands or startup brands that we're aware of, but for some reason, they really matter to us. And that's the holy grail for anybody, whether you're in the nonprofit sector, whether you're selling toothpaste, whatever it is. As we've looked at the meanings of brands over the years, we're seeing both in academic research and to some extent in the practitioner world, although not as much as I'd like to see yet, we're seeing some important evolutions in branding research, some differences in how we understand what a brand is and the important roles that it plays, and of course, how do we build a brand so that it's able to do that. So we see an evolution from the traditional focus, which is that the brand is something the firm controls. It's an asset that is totally under the control of the firm. Definitely not the case today. Today, brands are co-created entities. In other words, your customers actually play a very important role in sometimes in creating and certainly in defining the brand and advocating for the brand. So there's a tendency among some companies to try to push customers away, to not launch a product till it's absolutely perfect, but nobody gets to see it. Apple, I'm looking at you. But to some extent, that maybe that will work for Apple, but for most brands, it won't work that well, because your customers are going to want to be involved in that process. And I'll talk more about that. So we used to think that brands existed in the minds of consumers, and that's still true to some extent, but we need to recognize that in many cases, brands live in cultures. In other words, a brand, especially if it succeeds in becoming a resonant brand, becomes a part of that culture. And that means that many, many people who are tuned into the messages that culture is sending are going to be evaluating that brand in terms of how it helps us to commemorate various cultural happenings or occasions. So what's an example? Well, we have Halloween coming up next week. The practice of trick-or-treating was largely invented by a candy company, believe it or not, back about 100 years ago, or more than 100 years ago. And this candy company figured out that, it might be a good idea to get people to go door to door, and guess what they're collecting in their little bags, of course, is candy. So Halloween has become a major cultural phenomenon. Its meanings change over time, but obviously there's a huge role for marketers to play in that. And that's just one isolated example, of course. We used to focus on what brands mean, and we spent a lot of effort measuring this. So we might measure, on a scale from 1 to 7, to what extent is a brand sophisticated or sexy or practical or whatever that attribute is. And again, that's still important to some extent, but we have to recognize that brands are organic creatures. They are not the same from the time that they're hatched in the laboratory, if you will, to the time that people consume them, and then over the years start to modify the meanings of that brand. So we need to focus more on a longitudinal process to understand the roles that brands play in our daily lives. And again, how we as consumers over time often help to morph the meanings of those brands so that the company is not solely in control of those brand meanings. This all highlights the importance of a brand story. I believe there's even a presentation in the conference on brand stories. So important to tell a great brand story, because this is what customers are looking for today. They're not looking just for functionality. They assume that, frankly, in many cases, the product will do what it's designed to do. I don't know if they're right or not, but they assume that to be true. And so the way they're going to choose one brand over others often is in terms of the brand story that marketer is telling. And again, whether that story is going to resonate with their personal goals. That means we have to ask ourselves, how do we think about these customers? How do we think about these, depending on what you sell, it could only be a few people, or it could be millions of people. How do we think about these people? How do we try to connect with them if we're going to move them up this pyramid of involvement so that they really crave our brand? Well, unfortunately, this is how we often think of them. We often assume that all of our customers are pretty much the same. And this is an outgrowth of actually one of the most innovative and important developments in marketing practice ever, which is market segmentation, a concept really pioneered by General Motors back in the early part of last century, because Henry Ford famously said, my customers can have their car any color they want as long as it's black. And General Motors came along and said, well, you know what? Maybe not everybody wants a black car. Maybe there are differences. And so they started to look at how they could perhaps identify large homogeneous groups of people who share some characteristics like income, obviously. And so the various divisions of General Motors were born. And, if you can't afford a Cadillac, you can buy a Chevrolet. And that perspective worked very well for us for most of the last century, when we were really in a broadcasting mode. Even if you think about the way that we got our information, it was from maybe 3 or 4 broadcast television networks and large magazines. Obviously, that's not the case today. And so when we fast forward to now, we see that a lot of people are pushing back on this. Everybody wants to be unique, at least to some extent. everybody thinks, I'm different. I'm not the same person as the person next to me. And when I say to my students well, everybody in this class is, let's say, 20 years old, and you all share these characteristics, I guess that means you're all identical, right? They, as you might imagine, they are not happy about that. And they let me know it, because each of them thinks of him or herself as having a unique identity. And importantly, they are proactively using products and services to define those differences, not just those similarities. So the focus today is not on manipulating me as just a member of a market segment, but I will appreciate the companies that understand that I'm a unique individual, and I want that company to be unique as well. So I like to say, there are two kinds of people in this world: people who think there are two kinds of people, and people who don't. We have been trained, the reason I say that is most researchers have been trained in what's called the positivist tradition of science. And whether or not you've heard that word before, you know the outcomes of it. Basically, it's the scientific method. It's studying phenomena under very carefully controlled conditions. And importantly for us, putting things often into quadrants, may not be 4 quadrants, but labeling things in terms of similarities, and assuming that because we've given them a label, we therefore understand them. And as you look at whether in all parts of industry, whether it's management theory, marketing theory, we actually do see quite a few quadrants out there, a reflection of how many people have been trained, including myself, by the way. And again, that did make sense in a mass market world, because we recognize that not everybody has the same needs, and people with very, very short hair obviously are not good candidates for hairspray. But even these basic categories that we've relied upon for many, many years are blurring in amazing and fascinating ways. Whether it's how we define race or ethnicity. We see in the US Census, for example, it's needless to say, a huge politically charged question. Do we ask people about their race? How do they define their race? Are they allowed to use multiple categories? That conversation is very, very active today. In terms of age, we say 60 is the new 40. I hope that's true, by the way. And of course, gender is another example where the lines are blurring, and we talk about androgynous fashion. We talk about multiple definitions of gender, all of these things that I'm sure everybody is quite aware of. And so even the very basic so-called reliable demographic dimensions no longer have the kind of validity that they used to have. And so these categories are blurring. And as it turns out, we make a lot of very basic categorical assumptions in marketing. And these are in the form of a dichotomy. So one example that you all are painfully familiar with is home versus office, and this is, I guess, one change that, well, again, the pandemic obviously accelerated this. We used to make a distinction between your home and your office. And I think you know where I'm going with this. So for many of us, we're still trying to navigate this as our home and our office are literally merged together, just like this conference is doing today. This creates a lot of interesting things. You may remember during the lockdown, there was this BBC newscaster who made the headlines because he was doing his program from home, and then his kid appeared in the background. And I think this visual really, really defines this kind of disruption of the traditional dichotomy that we've held sacred for so many years, at least most of us, between home and office. So that's a good example of a fundamental category that is really going away. Market segmentation doesn't work as well in a so-called markets of one society. In other words, we have the ability today, especially for online behaviors, to literally customize our messages and, in some cases, our products to every individual's preferences. And so we have to really question some of these traditional positivist approaches really to market segmentation. Because we live today in what's been called a postmodern world where, again, many of these categories are blurring. And so lifestyles are blurring. You know, we have to throw away a lot of our assumptions and especially our stereotypes. You know, here's this kind of button down executive guy, but maybe on his lunch hour, he's getting some more ink, you know? So again, his lifestyle categories are merging quite a bit. And in a postmodern world, brands are still very, very important, but we are using them proactively to define who we are. And that means that a lot of these stale categories that we have traditionally used to understand our customers actually can be counterproductive because they block the path to resonance. I'll show you an example of what I mean. If we take a traditional category in the apparel industry, like athletic wear, that's been around for a long time, really, really static category, not doing much. Then we have another separate category, leisure wear. Same thing, kind of, you know, doing okay, but nothing great, at least before the pandemic. But a few years ago, we find that some smart people especially look at the wellness trend and they say, why don't we combine some characteristics of these two categories and now create a new category called athleisure? And I don't have to tell you how successful that merger of two categories has been. So just a quick warning, I recently published a book on this topic that I call The New Chameleons. And I use this metaphor of chameleons because it reflects how our identities today are changing so quickly in the same way that chameleons are able to change their colors so quickly as they adapt to different environmental conditions. So what that means is we have to let these new chameleons out of their cages in this postmodern world. And I want to very quickly go through 4 of those cages today. The first is me versus we, myself versus everything around me. And back in my day, we used to say, do your own thing. Everybody's an individual. Today, not so much. You know, what we see is kind of this hive mind effect. I describe it in my book where everybody needs to legitimize what they're doing by posting it on their media channels, on their social channels. I've had students tell me that they didn't know their boyfriend or girlfriend broke up with them until their relationship status changed on Facebook. So we're going from, I think, an era of me to an era of we, where it's much more about this collective consciousness. One of the positive things there is the explosion for marketers of user-generated content, where we are now able to go to this collective brain trust and actually involve our customers in the process of creation. I'll talk more about that, but really using many of the suggestions that they might make to guide our own decision making. This is a diagram that Google uses, and sorry, Google, but this is a great example of a big change that's going on today. They call this the ZMOT, or zero moment of truth, which is the point where the actual decision about the transaction is being made. And the point I want to make here is that we all, as consumers, ironically, are working much harder today to make these decisions. The internet was supposed to make our lives easier, but it actually makes it a lot harder, because even for many mundane decisions, what we're doing is a lot more search. We're clicking on YouTube videos, we're asking our networks. And that means that the traditional decision-making has been elongated. It also means that as a marketer, strategically, you need to insert yourself in the conversation much earlier than you used to. And so the new moment of truth is quite different, because we see that customers are accessing so much feedback from their networks before they ever make a decision. Let me skip over to cage number 2, which is the distinction between offline versus online. We said for years, I'm going online or I'm going offline. And so there's a digital dichotomy, but that really is not valid anymore, because many of us are living like we are right now in a merger between these two dimensions. And what that means is that a lot of the imagery that we're exposed to online, our entire assumption about what is, quote, real and what isn't has to be questioned, because of course we can do amazing things with by digitizing images. I like to think that the lips on this pig are not really that pig's lips, and lots of images that we see of people are definitions of beauty and body positivity and so on. We take an attractive model, but before we're going to put her onto a billboard or something, we're going to clean her up, so to speak. And so today we want to abandon that dichotomy. This is how Intel thinks about what they call connected computing. And the merger of online and offline means that we can either enhance the actual world, for example, augmented reality, where we're seeing both digital images and physical images, perhaps on our phones, or we can create new immersive digital worlds like virtual reality and multiplayer games. But in either case, we're going beyond the physical, and we're now integrating these two spheres that used to be separate. And I'm, in the interest of time, I'm going to skip over a few slides here. But I want to point out, if you happen to be interested in the fashion industry, there's so much activity going on online. It's really amazing. And again, augmented reality is really a game changer. For most people, this started with Pokemon Go a few years ago. But of course, there's a lot of great marketing applications here as well. And I urge you to think about this. For example, smart dressing room mirrors and other devices in stores that allow you to superimpose digital images on your physical image. Okay, cage number 3, producers of content versus consumers of content. Obviously, we talk a lot about the sharing economy. What does that mean? Well, it means that some of us are becoming hotel keepers, some of us are becoming taxi drivers or limo drivers, some of us are opening storefronts, even maybe we're in the direct selling business like Amway, Mary Kay, and so on. Again, the blurring of the boundaries between producers and consumers is important. It has some downsides to it, because once you hand the keys to the asylum over to the inmates, you never know what's going to happen. These are some actual examples I found of brand logos that people have altered in one way or another. But what I tell people is, you don't own your brand anymore. So just get over it, because brands are co-created entities. Okay, cage number 4. I know I'm going quickly, but I want to be sensitive to your time. The last cage I'll talk about today is flesh versus machine. And this is a fascinating one. We know that, of course, our bodies are a work in progress. We spend billions of dollars a year to try to modify them, whether it's cosmetics or clothing or bodybuilding or perhaps cosmetic surgery, as you see here. That's great, but we're also improving, if you will, or at least modifying our bodies by using machinery. And so today, I like to say, we don't just put things on, we put things in. And many people are walking around with machines or some kind of devices in their bodies, whether it's an artificial hip or a pacemaker or other things. But we're going to see increasingly that products are going to be serving multiple functions. So, for example, a contact lens that can obviously improve your vision, but it's also monitoring some of your physiological signs. If you're designing new products, you want to think about this and think of your product, if possible, as a smart delivery system. Can your product do more than one thing at a time? And if it can, that can be a huge advantage in the marketplace. Obviously, the wearables market, as people are increasingly monitoring their vital signs, and we expect to see over the years probably some of these wearables being implanted into our bodies. And in fact, that's happening already. There's a I hope, a small group of people that are practicing what's called do-it-yourself biology, or so-called biohackers, who are literally implanting devices into their own bodies to monitor their vital signs. Do not try this at home, please. A related strategy or tactic is identity marketing, where companies can use their customers, in a sense, as walking billboards. And there are a lot of creative ways to do this. Temporary tattoos, in some cases permanent ones I've seen, that of corporate logos. This is something that they're doing in Japan right now. So armpit advertising. Your advertising is the pits, I guess. And increasingly, the realism of these devices is really going to change the way we think about it. This is also an example of this merger that I mentioned earlier between offline and online. So these are not people that you're looking at here. These are avatars as they would appear if you were wearing an Oculus virtual reality headset. And you can see that we are moving to the point where it's going to be very difficult to distinguish the real from the fake. And you're probably familiar with deep fake videos that are doing exactly that. So again, a merger of boundaries that makes it really problematic to decide what is real and what isn't. And so these cages are opening. I talked very quickly about 4 of them today: me versus we, offline versus online, producer versus consumer, flesh versus machine. In my book, I talk about a lot of others. These are a few examples of those, but I think 4 is probably enough for one day, and I'm about out of time. If anyone's interested, I'm developing a course right now, an online course on how to engage your customers. Just drop me an email. I'd be happy to tell you about that. And of course, if anyone's interested in my book, I was able to get you a special conference discount for today. So if you want to go to this URL at checkout, just enter this discount code and get a discount. So that's all I've got. I think we probably have time for a few questions if there are any. And thanks for your attention. And go out there and open some cages.